right. As I said earlier, good to see everyone. We have a good crowd tonight, and if you're visiting, we're glad to have you. I want to begin by asking a question. You get a phone call, and you learn that a neighbor, a coworker, a friend, or maybe even a distant relative has passed away. What is the first thing? Well, maybe not the first thing, but what's one of the first things that you say or that pops into your mind? Okay, sorry, but what else? Oh no. Y'all are not cooperating. Are they a Christian? But don't we often say, why? He was so young. She was so healthy. She was just at church last week. Inevitably, the question that seems to come out, and along with some of those that you mentioned, but inevitably the question seems to be, why? And this is strictly speculation on my part, but don't you know that Adam and Eve, way back when, in the Garden of Eden, probably had the same question as they looked down on the lifeless body of their son. Is this thing coming through? I guess it is. Can't hear myself coming back. Did they not wonder? And of course, they'd had no experience with death. This was the first time. It was something totally new. And they're looking at their son laying there, and maybe he's asleep. He'll get up in a minute. And they realize that he is dead. And the question is, why did this happen? What's this all about? And ever since then, I suppose people have still asked that question, especially when the death is someone that we thought was healthy, someone that we considered young. And of course, the older we get, the younger everybody becomes, right? But we say, why? And oftentimes we ask somebody, and the answer that we get is, well, I don't know. Or another answer that I've heard many times, and I'm sure you've heard it, I've actually heard people say, well, it was his time or her time. You ever hear that one? It was their time to go. And somewhere between these two extremes of I don't know and it was their time to go, there's got to be a more reasonable answer to this question, why? And let's face it, most people are curious about death and dying, even though they don't want to talk about it. And it's amazing how many older people I've been visiting with. And you're sitting there and they want to talk. You can tell they're wanting. And finally, they'll get around to the question. I'm thinking of an older man, a man in his 90s I was visiting with, and he was very quiet, and finally he said, "Preacher, I want to ask you something. What's going to happen to me when I die?" And so we talked about it. And to my knowledge, we'd never discussed death before. It was a subject we just didn't talk about. But a lot of people have that question in the back of their mind, about death. Why? What? All these questions. And I suppose the more we know about death and dying, the better equipped we are to deal with it in our own lives. But also as Christians, we're better able to help other people cope with it. Perhaps people who are not in the church. And as we look out in the world, there's some reasons that you hear, some answers given to that question, why, that just strictly are not very reasonable. In fact, some of them are outrageous. For example, some try to explain or justify the death, especially the death of a child or the death of especially an infant or a toddler. And I've heard this one more than once. Oh, well, God needed another angel. Anybody else hear that? God needed another angel in heaven. And maybe some people find comfort in this explanation, but the fact is the Bible nowhere teaches this idea. The Bible does not support this idea. In fact, angels are not simply glorified human beings. And it's sad, but a lot of Christians think that angels are what? Dead people with wings, right? Heard people say, well, when they die, well, they finally got their wings. And the television program Touched by an Angel, for example, and there were several of them that have kind of fostered this idea that angels are nothing more than just glorified human beings. But the fact is, we don't become angels at death. Angels are set forth in Scripture as being created beings. They were created before the foundation of the world, before the creation of the world. They're not human in any way. Now, granted, they have taken on human form in Scripture. we read of angels and see angels, and they're described looking like a man. In fact, there were times that people didn't even realize that they were talking to an angel, at least initially. So there are others who believe that when a close loved one dies, maybe God's punishing someone, those left behind. And again, this is another one. Well, I guess God's punishing me for what I did. God's punishing me because I didn't do this or I have done that. And sadly, oftentimes mothers, young mothers, who lose a child, either at birth, in birth, or shortly after, they have this guilt complex. And maybe that's where this came from, this whole idea that God's punishing me. He took my child. And I've known of cases where people said, I'm not going back to church. I'm mad at God because God took my baby. And the Bible doesn't teach that God arbitrarily punishes us in this life by causing one to die, especially an innocent one. God never punishes the innocent if he were to do that for the wrongdoing of the adults or the parents. That whole idea is far into the Bible. And besides, if this idea were true, what would it make God? Well, now what? A respecter of persons. Because he took my child, my loved one, because I was a bad person. But here's another Christian over here who's just as bad, maybe worse, and God didn't take his. And Acts chapter 10 says that God is no respecter of persons. Still others believe that death is brought about directly by Satan. But again, Satan doesn't have that power, does he? How do you know Satan doesn't have the power to take life arbitrarily? Come on, think quick. Job, exactly. Read Job chapter 1 and verse 2. You remember God's extolling the virtues of Job to Satan, and he says, have you considered my servant Job? And, he's faithful, he's righteous, and all these things. And of course, Satan couldn't just say, yeah, you're right, Job's a good man. He began to badmouth. Well, of course he serves you. You've given him everything. You put a fence around him. And he says to God, but put forth thine hand now and touch all that he hath, and he will curse thee to thy face. It was like a challenge to God. And so God tells Job, okay, you can afflict him, but you can't what? Not yet. You're getting ahead of me. You can't touch him physically. In other words, you can take his belongings, you can take his children, you can take his servant, but you can't touch him physically, personally. So all these bad things happen, and it's a great story because it says, in all of this, Job sinned not nor charged God foolishly. He lost his servants, he lost his children, he lost property, he lost his flocks and herds. Remember, he was a wealthy man. He was wiped out. But yet in all of this, he did not charge God foolishly. So Satan comes back, and God kind of says, okay, Satan, look, I let you do all this. He maintained his integrity, and that's a paraphrase. And again, Satan, instead of saying, okay, God, you were right, Job's a good man, he says, yea, and this is the King James, yea, skin for skin, yea, all that a man hath will he give in exchange for his life. And then he throws down the gauntlet to God. He said, but put forth thine hand now and touch his bone and his flesh. In other words, you afflict him personally. He will curse you to your face. And so God says, okay, you can afflict Job personally, but what? Now, somebody said that the first time around, but what? You can't kill him. You can't take his life. The point being, Satan has limited ability. Can you think what it would be like if Satan had the power to arbitrarily take our lives or the lives of our loved ones? Well, not just that, but think about it. Every time we stumbled, if you stumbled or sinned, before you had a chance to repent, the old devil would take you out. None of us would stand a chance. Satan does not have the power to directly take our lives. Yeah, but see, that was after God. At first, he couldn't do anything to him personally. Just took his children, took his flocks, took his herds, took his servants, all those things. And then the devil said, okay, touch him personally and he'll curse you. So God said, okay, you can afflict him, just don't kill him. And boy, Satan did everything but. In fact, he probably wished, well, he did. If you read it, Job wished he was dead more than once. He said, I wish I had been stillborn. I wish I had died at birth. I wish I'd never seen the light of day. Because he was in that much misery because his body was covered with those sores. Curse God and die, or renounce God and die. Yeah. Yeah. Yes. Another explanation for why death happens, and you don't hear this one from Christians, at least I never have, but sometimes those who are superstitious in nature will say that, well, someone from the spirit world came and took him. And again, the Bible nowhere teaches that. There's no need to even spend time on that one. That one is so far-fetched. Still others will face the death of a loved one by saying, oh, well, it was meant to be. And again, most of these are designed to comfort those who are grieving, right? I mean, it's very difficult. You're standing next to your brother or your sister or a close family member who's lost a dear loved one. It's always hard to know what to say, isn't it? I've done almost 160 funerals in 40 plus years of preaching. And I still don't know what to say. I've learned sometimes it's just best not to say anything at all. Just be there. And I don't say that to be funny. I don't say it to be facetious. Sometimes people don't want anything. So they just want you to be there, to know you care. But sometimes trying to comfort, oh, well, it was meant to be. Just you got to face it. It was meant to be. But that's not the case. Death is not premeditated. In other words, God doesn't have this all planned out, His will. It was going to happen no matter what. In fact, I had a member of the church tell me, oh, when your turn comes to die, you're going to die. I said, I don't believe that. And I said, you don't either. If you do, get out there on 270 and step out in front of a semi doing 70 miles an hour. You're going to die whether it's your time or not. I'll guarantee it. And he never said any more about that. No, I don't believe this, that it's your time to die. This is what? This is nothing more than predestination, isn't it? Well, whatever happens was predestined. It was predetermined. No, to a great degree, we determine our destiny, don't we? By the choices that we make, by the actions that we take. But no, I don't subscribe to this idea of fatalism that, hey, was it Doris Day that used to sing that the song, Que sera, sera, whatever will be, will be. No, that's not true. At least not from a biblical perspective. The Bible doesn't teach that we're under the rule of fate. And there are many other explanations for death, and there's certainly not time for us to cover all of them in this class tonight. But I do want to move on and consider some biblical reasons. Because invariably, preachers and elders and other Christians are asked, especially by non-Christian people, you're at the funeral home or you're in someone's home and they're grieving and they're sorrowing a loved one. And maybe they just look at you and say, why? Why did this happen? It's one thing when this person was on up in years or they've been in bad health, but, when it's a 16-year-old child, an 18-year-old child, when it's a young mother, when it's a baby or young toddler, and they look at you and they say, why did this happen? What do we say to them? Now, this first one has nothing to do with children, so don't misunderstand. But we need to understand some of the reasons why death occurs. One of them is because of sin. The Bible teaches that physical death is a result of sin. Maybe not a direct sin that I have committed, but ultimately what brought sin into the world? Sin. Adam and Eve disobeyed. That brought sin on man, didn't it? And ever since then, people have died. Some young, some not so young. of course, we're not going to take the time to go back and read that narrative of Genesis 2 and 3 there, but Adam and Eve disobeyed God, and he told them, the day that you eat thereof, you're going to die. They died spiritually that day. They were separated from God. And by the way, that's the meaning of death, separation. Physical death is the separation of the body and the spirit. Spiritual death is the separation of man from God. They were physically dead that day. They were separated, severed from God. And they begin to die physically that day. Their bodies begin to age and to decay. And from that day forward, physical death has been a part of man's existence. Paul confirmed this in Romans 5 and verse 12. Wherefore, as by one man sin entered into the world, and death by sin. And so death passed upon all men, for that all have sinned. So Paul makes it clear, sin brings death. Everyone sins, therefore everyone dies. And 1 Corinthians 15 sets forth the very same idea there. Verse 21 and 22. Secondly, death is an appointment that we all have. And again, I don't want to spend a lot of time on this point, but Hebrews 9:27 says it's appointed unto man once to die, and after this cometh the judgment. If you want an interesting word study, look up the word here, which is translated appointed. It means to be laid away, to be laid up in store, to be reserved, to be in store for something. In other words, death is in store for all of us. The only exception to that rule is what? What? Yeah. If we're still living when the Lord returns, we're not going to experience physical death. But otherwise, we're all going to die. The Old Testament abounds with passages, some of them clearer than others. But Ecclesiastes 12 and verse 7, the wise man says, and the dust returneth to the earth as it was, and the spirit returneth unto God who gave it. Now that's about as simple as it can be. The physical body is going to return to the earth. I don't care how well you preserve it. I don't care how well you embalm it. Eventually this physical body is going to return to the earth. And he says the spirit, the soul is going to return to God who gave it. Again, Job 34, going back to the narrative we were talking about earlier. Job 34 and verse 15. Remember, Elihu was one of the men who came and talked with Job and, reprimanded Job, I guess we would call it. But anyway, this is what Elihu said. He said, all flesh shall perish together, and man shall turn again unto the dust. And of course, Solomon in Ecclesiastes 9:5 says, the living know that they shall die. Why? Because death is an appointment. Now, I don't know how long it took Adam and Eve and their children and their grandchildren to finally figure out that everybody eventually died, but surely it didn't take that long for them to realize the brevity of this physical life. You know, we make appointments and we break appointments every day. You know, you make an appointment with your dentist and you change your mind, you get cold feet, you call them up and say, hey, I'm not going to be able to make it. Let me reschedule it. Or maybe you've got an appointment to have lunch with a friend or a coworker or something, and maybe something genuinely comes up. You shoot them a text, hey, I can't make it. Give me a rain check. But this is an appointment that we're all going to keep. There will be no missing. There will be no rain checks for death. David wrote in Psalm 39:4, Lord, make me to know mine end and the measure of my days, what it is, that I may know how frail I am. Notice that phrase there, make me to know mine end. In other words, realize the brevity of life. Realize how frail life is. And because of that, I'll kind of sidetrack here from the main point of this lesson. Knowing that it's an appointment, that ought to tell us that we want to prepare for it, right? You know, if you have something at work, an evaluation, you want to have all your stuff together there, you know, what you've done, what your sales. Ned, I know you're one of those, you have a yearly, what do they call yours? Evaluation? Annual review. They want to know how many caterpillars and blades and parts you sold, right? Yeah. And Ned knows he's going to be called on the carpet for it. Well, in much the same way, God's going to call us on the carpet, not for what we've sold on the job, but there's still going to be an evaluation. It won't be an annual evaluation. It's going to be a lifetime evaluation. And for that reason, we need to be prepared for it. I ran across a quote that I thought was not only interesting, but very biblical. And I don't know who the man is. I have a name here, Emmons. But this quote says, "Death stamps the character and conditions of men for eternity." And this second sentence is what I really thought was great. "As death finds them in this world, so will they be in the next." There'll be no changes when we leave this life. If we die prepared in this life physically, we're going to be prepared in the next life. If we're unprepared when we die, we're still going to be unprepared. Before our time gets away, I did want to make some observations that I hope will be pertinent. For example, it is possible to hasten the time of our death. You know, sadly, we see examples of this almost every day. You know, people driving the car down the freeway 90 miles an hour, and maybe they're putting on makeup or they got their phone up texting. It's an accident waiting to happen, isn't it? You think, well, it's just a matter of time. Or maybe they're engaging in some other dangerous activity, whether it's, drugs, illegal drugs, or drinking and driving, or whatever the case may be. But a lot of people in this life are hastening their life. By the way, the young lady I was telling about that came to the tent, her father had died. I didn't relate one of the things she told me. I asked her what had happened. I said, well, how old was your dad? And she said, well, he was about, I think she said 72 years old. And I said, well, I'm sorry, that's young. I said, how did he die? She said, he drank himself to death. And then she went on to explain. She said, my mother died 6 months ago, and Dad didn't want to live. And that was his way out. She said he wanted to die, and he drank himself to death. That's an example of someone hastening the day of their death. But secondly, I would suggest to you that God does know when we shall die. Now, that's different than saying God makes us die, as we were talking about a while ago. David in Psalm 31:15 said, my times are in thy hand. Again in Psalm 139, verse 16, thine eyes did see my substance, yet being unperfect, and in thy book all my members were written, which in continuance were fashioned as yet when there was none of them. In other words, God created him, and God knew when he would die, when he would leave this physical body. One of the verse, Psalm 102, verse 23, he shortened my days. I said, oh my God, take me not away in the midst of my days. God is the giver of life. And God has the power over life, but at the same time, God gives us the ability to lengthen or shorten. In other words, if you want to shorten your life, you live a wild, rambunctious life. And chances are, you will die younger. On the other hand, take care of yourself. Don't ride four-wheelers up the side of mountains. Chances are, don't point that finger at me. Live a little bit longer. In fact, what New Testament passage attributes lifestyle with length of days? Who can remember? I'll give you a clue. It's in Ephesians. Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor thy father and mother, which is the first commandment with promise, that it may be well with thee, and what? And thou mayest live long on the earth. Now that's not an ironclad. It's like in the book of Ecclesiastes and the wisdom literature. There's statements made that don't always hold true. They're the general rule, but there are always exceptions. And in this case, he said, look, if you are an obedient child, that's going to carry over into your life, and you're probably going to live a long life. Whereas the rebellious child at home, the disobedient, rebellious, wild child is going to grow up to be what? A rebellious, wild adult. And they may not live as long. And so again, there are exceptions to that rule, but nonetheless. Just talked about the fact. We can also prolong our life. I said we could cut it short, but at the same time, it's possible to prolong our life. And I'm not going to get into a lecture on health because, I don't care who you are, we all could be healthier. As far as what we eat or what we don't eat, exercise, sleep, and things like that. But Proverbs 10:27 says, the fear of the Lord prolongs our days, but the years of the wicked shall be shortened. And I think that could apply in different ways there. King Hezekiah is a good example. Isaiah chapter 38. Who remembers what happened to Hezekiah? Okay, God sent Isaiah, the prophet, to go see King Hezekiah. And King Hezekiah was a good king. And basically, he told the king, he said, set thine house in order. In other words, get everything together because you're going to die. And Hezekiah turned his face to the wall, the text says, and he wept. And he prayed. And before the prophet gets away from the palace, God sends him back and says what? He says, I'm going to give you 15 more years. Again, the idea that God has, power over life. He prolonged his life. He added to it. Philippians 2:27, Paul says there that God extended mercy in times of sickness to one of his co-workers. And Paul was grateful for that because he talks about how grieved, how heartbroken he would have been had he lost that brother. Sometimes people die just simply because of the result of sickness. And again, this goes back to the idea that we're all going to die of something. But, the fact is our physical bodies are very frail. Sometimes it's a genetic problem. It may be a sickness that we have contracted. I know a missionary who went to Africa several years ago, and he got a parasite from, I suppose, drinking, as I understood it, drinking the water. He got a parasite, and for the next 4 or 5 years, the doctors tried to do something, and they could not eradicate the parasites from his body because they multiplied. And eventually, he died from it. His life was cut short. A sickness that he had, contracted. And the fact is, people get sick and people die. Not just young people, not just old people, young people as well. Healthy people. And sometimes it seems like those who are frailest sometimes live the longest. Who was the big wrestler that died just about a year ago? I'm not a wrestling fan. Ned, you're into wrestling, aren't you? No, just kidding. But it was one of the big name. And you look at the guy. I mean, he was built. Really big, muscular guy. He looked like the prime specimen. And he was either a stroke or a heart attack, and he was dead just like that. So, again, it goes back to the idea that we don't have any guarantee. But, another time, we can't leave out, sometimes we die because of disobedience. There's certain laws that are in place. Physical laws, for example. You step off the building high enough, you're going to die. That's the law of nature. But also, sometimes people disobeyed God's law. Whether we're talking about engaging in immoral behavior and contracting a disease such as AIDS or something like that, and they died. They died because of sin, because of disobedience, or using illegal drugs, and maybe they get bad drugs, or they overdose, or something of that nature. In the Old Testament, we have several that died because of disobedience. Back in Leviticus 10:1 and 2, you read of Nadab and Abihu. They disobeyed God, and they died. Uzzah reached up and touched the ark as it was being transported back by King David, and he was struck dead. Good intentions, but he disobeyed God, and he died. Ananias and Sapphira in the book of Acts, chapter 5, they lied to God and to Peter, and they were struck dead. And there are many other examples that we could talk about. The fact is that there are any number of reasons. And personally, I don't think, when people ask me why, generally, I will say, we can't be sure, we don't know. And we don't. I mean, obviously, if somebody dies of an overdose, we know why they died. But that's not the kind of thing you're going to say to the grieving family, is it? It's not my place to pass judgment. But as Christians, we want to, Paul said about weep with those that weep, rejoice with those that rejoice. Well, it's easy to rejoice, isn't it? I mean, times are good, everybody's happy. It's easy to celebrate and to party and to rejoice with them. But on the other hand, when times are hard, whether we're talking about the loss of a job or the loss of a loved one, that's a little harder. And yet both of those commands are there in the same passage of Scripture, to comfort and to grieve. And so we have to learn how, and again, sometimes it's just best not to say anything, just to let them know that we care. What was that, Dave? That wasn't the bell, was it? Okay, well, by that clock, it's not time for the bell, but it sure sounded like it rang. But the bottom line is we don't know where or how or when our life will end. And I think I mentioned this Sunday in one of the sermons. That's not really what's important. The important thing is to be ready when that time comes. And then it won't matter. I've heard people say, well, I'm in India, for 4 or 5 weeks. I've had people say, well, what if you die over there? Well, I'll be dead. It doesn't matter if I die in India or if I die in Franklin County. It doesn't change a thing, does it? But what is important is being ready to die. Whether we're at home, whether we're on the job, whether we're on the highway or in a hospital, battling some sickness or disease. But again, this is just a part of this class on death and dying that I think is important that we understand. Different reasons why people die. And the way that we approach it, the way that we deal with others, says a great deal about us. If people see that as Christians we're able to deal with, and that's not to say that Christians don't grieve, that we don't sorrow. But remember what Paul said to the Thessalonians about grieving? He said, we sorrow not. Now, but it didn't stop there, does it? He didn't say we sorrow not. He said, we sorrow not as those which have no hope. In other words, the Christian sorrowing, the Christian's grief is different than the grief of the person in the world. Ned?
Just so you know, if you die in India, I think I can speak for everybody here, we're not coming to your viewing.
I'm just going to have my ashes flown. Okay. But if I'm in Costa Rica, you'll come, right? I'll just have my ashes flown home. But made me lose my train of thought there, Ned. Okay, but I'll make note of that. Ned will not come to my viewing in India. But the way that we approach death and grieving, I think is very important. People look at us. And when they see the Christian, they're grieving. They're sorrowing for the loss of a loved one, but not. I've done some funerals for people who were agnostic at best. I won't say they were atheist. And the reaction of the family was just almost hysterical. On the other hand, I've done funerals for Christian families where there were tears. And maybe they're saying, I'll miss you, Mother. I'll miss you, Dad, or whoever the loved one was. But the entire approach to grieving was totally different. Yeah.
So my dad's mother had a massive stroke along with one that was back. She was in the hospital right now under hospice care. This is her 90.
Didn't know.
And I talked to Dad on the way home today, and she's a Christian. She's been a member of the church for 7 years. And I asked him, they talk about grieving, it's just a waiting game until she passes before the body starts to shut down. He said, he said, I'm actually happy because she didn't want to be a person. She didn't want people to have to care for her. She's going somewhere where her body's not going to hurt anymore. And we're comforted. Right? She is a faithful Christian.
Yeah.
You're right, it makes that so much easier. If you know that they're safe and they're in Christ.
Yep.
Versus someone that's living in the world.
Now, that's a beautiful illustration of what I'm saying there. The outlook the Christian has in a situation like this is totally different. And people see that. They realize, wow, you view death so differently than we do. So, did you start raising your hand? Okay, thought I saw the hand go up. Questions or comments? Your time is just all but gone. Nothing? All right. Well, we will just dismiss. The bell should be ringing here in a minute.